All right. So I'm Amy Riggleman, and we have a link to our slides on the first slide here, and the numbers are 426C. It's kind of hard to see those. And so I'm talking first about the reproducibility crisis from a historical lens, and then bringing us up to date while Alicia's going to step in and talk about more practical applications. I am a social sciences within our library system here. We have many subject librarians and many different libraries. Each subject librarian supports different departments. So I am the library liaison to EdPsych, Child Development, and then two in CLA, Psychology and Speech, Language, and Hearing Sciences. So in 2017, I attended a Reproducibility Training Institute at Berkeley. Berkeley has something called the Initiative for Transparency in the Social Sciences. So they have this reproducibility training that they hold a couple of times a year in different campuses. And so I attended one that was in Berkeley, but I know they've done international things as well. And so it was pretty awesome to be in a room full of people all learning about reproducibility. I was one of 4 librarians, and the rest of the attendees were a mix of social science fields, some professors, some graduate students. It was just a really neat opportunity, and so a lot of what I know about reproducibility is from what I learned at that. Okay, so I think it's important that we talk a little bit about the definitions. Because the words reproducibility and replicability are often used interchangeably, but they're actually different. And then I think we should talk about the quibbling over the word crisis. So the definitions that I like to use for reproducibility and replicability come from an NSF report that's cited on the bottom of the slide here. So reproducibility is the ability of a researcher to duplicate the results of a prior study using the same materials and procedures as were used by the original investigator. So the exact same things. So that would be like running code or more computational reproducibility. Whereas replicability is the ability of a researcher to duplicate results of a prior study if the same procedures were followed, but new data are collected. So folks in this room are probably familiar with reproducibility project psychology. That was technically a replication project. So you'll start to hear these words being used interchangeably. We'll see what happens with the changing definitions. I have a feeling that people are just going to start accepting the differences. Okay, so in terms of whether or not this is a crisis, I'd encourage you to think of yourself or to consider where you land on this spectrum. So on one end, we have folks who say that the status quo is broken and significant changes are needed. So I have the fire emoji there, like burn it all down, tenure is broken, our scholarly communication, peer review process is broken, we need to make significant changes. Whereas on the other side, we have folks who feel like it's self-correcting. Things are corrected and retractions are submitted to the literature, so we just keep on keeping on, and no changes are necessary. Personally, I would put myself about here, where it's very concerning, but I'm thinking that we're starting to make changes that can fix these problems. So I'm not saying one side is better than the other. We all fit on different places within the spectrum. Okay, so I also think it's important to separate what we're talking about today in the honest errors from the more nefarious behavior. So I have my image here of the bad apples. Because I want to mention this, I think it's important because the failed replication from this psychology project got a lot of press, negative press for science. But at the same time, we're also hearing about some scholars who were more nefarious and not doing these honest errors. It was more egregious than that. So we had a scholar from Cornell who's now had at least 15 studies retracted. I think that number may have gone up now. So he's somebody that studies nutrition and marketing, a few different, interdisciplinary work. And so he's somebody that was featured in the press quite often talking about his research, and then now is starting to kind of crumble. Things are starting to get retracted. And Diederik Stapel is a pretty bad apple. He's a social psychologist who's had many, many things retracted now, and he's confessed to just completely making studies up. So fraudulent, flawed, very, very flawed studies. So I'm working kind of backwards here in terms of talking about the history. So folks in this room might be familiar with a piece by John Ioannidis in 2005. Ioannidis was actually on campus, I think it was last year, for the Research Ethics Week. So he had a very controversially titled article, Why Most Published Research Findings Are False. And so he started to kind of shine a light on some of these issues. In the meantime, we had the Reproducibility Project Psychology and Reproducibility Project Cancer Biology. Those were large-scale attempts to replicate studies, so hundreds of studies, and they were selecting from high-impact journals. And at least for the psychology project, the results were not good. So I think the number is 39% of the studies were able to replicate, showing the same results. Cancer biology study had to be closed down very early in the process because they were not given access to the research methods and study materials of many of the studies. So due to the lack of transparent reporting in the original pieces, they just didn't have anything to go on, and so they weren't able to replicate for that reason. But we could look back even further. We could look back all the way back to the history of the scientific method in declaring your hypothesis. More recent than that, we've had all of these articles here. They're on our citation slide at the end too, if you want to cite them or access them. But we have folks that are addressing questionable research practices throughout time, but they didn't get quite the press that these last three pieces have gotten. But folks have been concerned about questionable research practices from way back. And when I say questionable research practices, I'm referring to these things. So I'm going to go more in depth on these things, but commonly talked about with QRPs would be p-hack, HARC, underpowered studies, and bias against the null, often called file drawer problem. So p-hacking, do folks generally know what this means? Seen some heads, okay. So data dredging, data fishing, when data is collected and then kind of dig through to find something exciting, find something significant. Similarly, HARC means hypothesizing after the results are known. So they're quite similar, where somebody acts as if their hypothesis was one thing, but it was actually another. And so this is where pre-registration and register reports are favored. Another problem is underpowered studies. So I know there's an effort now to have people be more upfront about their sample sizes and their abstracts. And so wanting on the front end to know how powerful a study was or if it was underpowered. Underpowered study meaning that there could be false positives or unreliable results and therefore erroneous conclusions. And there are, Frank mentioned this a little bit, contributing factors. So some people blame the tenure system for not rewarding replication. So folks are saying replication is so important, but it doesn't get any credit. Tenure system does not reward data sharing, and it doesn't reward transparent reporting. And it doesn't reward studies that aren't unique and novel. So what happens when folks do their research and they have results that are kind of lackluster, they may decide not to publish. And so that could be because they know that a journal won't publish it at all, because they'll receive it and say, well, why are we publishing this? This isn't significant. Or they could choose not to publish it because they know it won't be rewarding to them in the tenure tenure process. And so they put it in their file drawer. So that's what I'm referring to when talking about bias against the null and file drawer problems. We're starting to see some policy-based solutions. So more and more journals are signing on to the top guidelines. Are folks familiar with those? Something that came out of a group of people, including the Center for Open Science, where they have made recommendations for how transparent folks are about reporting from the whole research life cycle, including declaring hypothesis with registration. The reporting guideline that I use most frequently is PRISMA, and it's specific to systematic reviews. Is anyone in this room familiar with PRISMA? Okay, so there's different guidelines for lots of different methods. There's different guidelines for lots of different disciplines, and my favorite place to locate guidelines is called Equator Network. So I highly recommend going to Equator Network. It's created for the health sciences, but it is inclusive of other disciplines as well. And so you could do a search to see what guidelines are available to help you make decisions about how transparent you want to be. Okay? Or if a journal says, we require that systematic reviews follow the PRISMA guidelines, then you would be able to find them here. And then registration has been mentioned now a few times, but journals and funders are starting to be more forward about what they're requiring or suggesting. So journals are starting to have incentives like badges. So putting a badge next to an article that has open data or pre-registered. Funders have been requiring data management or data transparency and reporting now for several years. And then registration, meaning that places like Center for Open Science and Prospero and Cochrane and Campbell have dedicated repositories for pre-registration. So you are upfront saying, this is what I intend to do, this is what I'm looking to study, and even have pre-registered analysis plans. Registered reports is similar, but this is when you're working directly with a journal. So some journals have gone all in on registered reports, or they will have special issues that are all registered reports, where they require the peer review to happen on the front end. So you submit your plan, you submit your hypothesis, and then they judge whether or not it will be included in the journal based on that submission. And then you do the study, you perform the study, and regardless of if the results are significant, they agree to publish your manuscript. They still do the copy editing and things, but it's a way to avoid the bias against the null file drawer problem. Okay, so most of this content that Alicia and I are showing today is prior to November 2018. So November 2018 is when we presented to the Senate Research Committee about this topic. And so some exciting things have happened, including the Department of Education's Institute for Educational Sciences, IES, yes. Released companion guidelines on replication and reproducibility. So this is a several-page report. It was kind of fun and exciting when I saw it posted. And it's guidelines, so it's not requirements, but it is helpful to see education framed through this replication and reproducibility lens. So they're referencing things in there like registration. And I'm glad that they're thinking through these things.
If I can add, they also indicated that they will be trying to fund a series of reproducibility of replications as part of the IES grants this summer.
Right, and that's exactly what I'm referring to right here. Thank you. So the IES director has a nice write-up. I think this was also released at least in late November, early December, where they're explaining more about advocating for replication and potentially funding it. They are prioritizing replications of funding that's come from within. So it's kind of exclusive. It's not encouraging, well, how do I say this? They're just going to prioritize past studies that came through them or was funded through the Department of Education. And then this is very recent. I just saw this posted and I haven't had much chance to look at it, but folks may be familiar with many babies. What were the other many things? Many labs, many primates, lots of like large-scale projects where different labs were doing like the same study. So other efforts would be like study swap, saying I have this study idea, I'm going to run it in my lab, I'd like for somebody else to run it in their lab to try to make a study more powerful, try to avoid that questionable research practice of underpowered studies. So many classes, this was just shared online, is an opportunity for people to test the same like educational experimentation, but in different classrooms. Yeah.
Who's running that? Like, where does that sit?
So I think that this was shared by Brian Nosek from the Center for Open Science on Twitter, but I'm not quite sure how involved he is. I haven't explored it. Are you able to? Nope.
I'm not.
Okay, so I should probably go back to my slides. But this link right here and these link to that particular page. Super new, really exciting. Do we have any kinesiology folks in the room? Okay, so this is very new as well. It's called STORC, Society for Transparency, Openness, and Replication in Kinesiology. So they have this new web presence. They have a preprint repository that's very new called Sport Archive, and that's through the OSF Preprints Center for Open Science. And there was a really nice 538 write-up about kinesiology taking on reproducibility and replicability and starting to have a more awareness of that. So this was a brief history. Do you have any questions for me before I pass it on to Alicia? Okay.
So my name is Alicia Hovick-Moore. I work in the College of Liberal Arts Lattice. And just a little bit briefly about me is I'm the research support coordinator. I run a team of research professionals who help with people with research. So Lattice stands for Liberal Arts, Technologies, and Innovation Services. We're a very similar group to the RMCC that I know Ethan is part of here. I also, I'm a cognitive psychologist by training, and I like to think of my start in reproducibility was many weeks and hours I spent trying to replicate a manipulation check by Diederik Stapel, which didn't work. Surprise, surprise. It turns out it was an open secret. Everyone knew it, but no one wrote it down. But so now I teach a lot of workshops on reproducibility and reproducible methods in terms of data collection and analysis, particularly in R. I also work with the libraries quite a bit. I serve as a curator for our open data repository here at the University of Minnesota, which is called DRUM, Data Repository at the University of Minnesota. So when people submit data in the social sciences, particularly in my college, I look at the data set, I will run their code, another set of eyes to make sure it's understandable. And we have a network of disciplinary experts who curate data for that. I also drank the Kool-Aid for the Center of Open Science. I am one of their ambassadors, which I'm not sure what that means, except for I get the sweet stickers. And I also serve on the Open Science Badges Committee. So Amy mentioned badges. Frank was handing out those sweet badge stickers. So instead of tricking out your laptop, badges are something that's used to trick out journal articles by journals. And so there's a committee of us. There's currently 3 badges: open data, open materials, and pre-registration. And there's a group of us who evaluate, do we need more badges? What are the limits of the badges? What are the parameters around badging? And how does it happen through open science? And also I've been involved in several research collaborations that I'll talk a little bit about on evaluating kind of the meta-science behind reproducibility. So that's why I am here and interested. So I talked about badges. I like to think of them as nerd stickers for journal articles. And the goal here is, how do we get people to share data? And it's kind of a carrot approach. And so there's been a lot of research on the effectiveness of badges. So in 2014, Psych Science, which is one of the biggest, for those who are in psychology know this, journals in psychology, decided to have badges. So when people share their data or make their materials open or pre-register a study, you get a little badge next to your article that signals these good behaviors. And so they found that there was a sharp increase after this policy happened in people making their data available, having those open data statements in their articles. And that studies that earned the badges were more likely to have the data actually available and findable. And to have the correct data there, so what was happening. So they are effective. In addition to badges as an effort, Amy mentioned that many journals are adapting policies for data sharing. For example, requiring or suggesting open data. The top guidelines suggest a range of policies depending on how involved a journal wants to be. One recent bit of research that I was involved in was evaluating the effectiveness of some of these policies. So in the journal Cognition implemented an open data policy in March 2015. And so if we looked at the number of articles that had open data or data available afterwards, there was an increase after the policy, and that trend has continued to rising. So these things are effective in getting people to make their data more available. Another thing that's been happening in the landscape of this as a result of all this talk is that retractions are continuing to increase. And this is a trend that is not new. So this has been a trend for the last 20 plus years, noted in a number of journal articles. But they've been increasing sharply, specifically around 2010 to 12 when these the p-hacking papers started to come out, started to be talking about at conferences. And the rate of growth is also rising, and these numbers are till 2016 or 17, so I'm not sure what is happening after there. But there's a number of people who believe these are a good thing, right? That means more people are paying attention, that journals are more willing to correct errors, make the record known. So advocates who are thinking less of a crisis are thinking, this is part of the self-correcting. This is a good sign. Other things that are happening as a result of this reproducibility awareness is that there's more visibility of what's called interim research products. So the things that tell research findings or capture research that aren't the published article. And so this is from an NIH notice that's encouraging people to not only use interim research projects, but also to cite them in their progress reports. And so these can include things like pre-registrations. So this is the pre-registration badge that Amy mentioned. So when you make public your plans for your data collection and analysis, citing that as progress of your research. As well as preprints. So when you submit a manuscript, making public that submission in a preprint that is citable. And so there's a number of different topical preprint archives, including the SciArchive, the Knies one now. BITS has their own. I was recently, a few of the projects I was involved in, this was the first time where we submitted a preprint as we submitted the manuscript, and we actually had quite a bit of interest in what we're doing. So one of the fears that I hear people thinking is about scooping. So if I submit, a preprint before I've gotten my manuscript accepted, what if someone steals my idea? But really my experience has been you get more awareness of your work early on. So you have a time-stamped marker that you had this manuscript in the public. People are already knowing about your work even before it's been published. So I find that encouraging rather than discouraging. Another thing we're seeing in a similar vein is an increase in born open data materials. So in addition to people sharing their data at the end of their study when they publish in their journals or in repositories, there's also an increased trend of just being open from the beginning. So when you're doing a project, using tools from the Center of Open Science, they have this Open Science Framework. Are any of you familiar with this tool? I see a few nods. So this is a really nice online way to manage a project, and you can make it private, and you can open it pieces up publicly as much as you want. And there's ways to snapshot it and get identifiers and pre-register on that site. So starting early, helping people get involved in your projects, using things like GitHub, which is like Facebook for nerds, I like to say, which is sharing code and other things, and analytical code you're working on, and making those things public, making awareness of the work you're doing before you've published. Another really great thing that's been happening, and Amy touched on this a bit, is more team-based research. So whenever we do a research study in our own lab, we collect data, we find effects. That's a one snapshot in time of those effects. So what's more powerful is if we can replicate that across many, many different labs, or have many, many different teams and people contribute to a project. And so now with this more team-based research and these things like the Center for Open Science and the different OSF platforms, being able to host that kind of collaboration, a lot more things are possible. I was involved in this Many Analysts One Dataset project. This is where we were looking at all the different decisions and degrees of freedom, if you will, that go into analysis. So they gave teams, I think we had 26 different teams of analysts, same data set, same hypotheses, analyze the data, different results. And so depending on choices in covariates, how we treat outliers, things like that, we can have very different results even with the same hypothesis. So it was a really nice illustration about just how many things go into someone's results, how many decisions are made, how many things we need to keep transparent. Amy mentioned the Many Labs and Many Babies projects. So those are both coordinated efforts, and I believe both of those were centered through the Center for Open Science, but led by researchers at many different universities to study different phenomena across different labs. Many labs were responsible for that first reproducibility project, Psychology, which was published in Science in 2015. The recently Many Labs 2 just came out in the Advances in Methods and Practice in Psychological Science, AMPS, just I think last month. And so they had a really interesting results around when we run a study in many different sites across many different cultures and online versus in person, what's the variability there? Especially when people are finding things that don't replicate. People are saying, well, you know, you didn't run the procedure exactly the same, or what if your sample is different than my sample? And what they're finding is really the variation in effects across samples, across cultures, across locations, across languages are actually big only for the big effects. It doesn't seem to be contributing much to those effects that aren't replicating, which was really interesting and something we would never be able to do in a single lab. And similarly, the bigger reproducibility projects in psychology and cancer biology have happened, which Amy talked about. There's also more ways to connect. So those big groups are one way you can connect with other researchers who are interested in the same things, but there's also sites where if you have an idea, you can try to figure out if there are others working on the same thing. Study Swap is one example of that. I believe, Amy, you're involved on the board of Study Swap. Many Labs is another one. Psychological Science Accelerator is another one, as well as Science Exchange. So you can propose an idea, or you can search those sites to see what other ideas people have and connect with different collaborators interested in the same stuff. One caution though, there's been a lot of focus on replicability. So when I have things and I run it in new data and collect new data, do I get the same effects? The psychological science project was that. The many labs are doing that. Cancer biology, that was their goal. One thing I was recently involved in is a step back from that. So when we're sharing data, when we're sharing our code or describing what we've done, one question that I think is more primary is, can we reproduce what we've done? So with the same data, with the same code and the descriptions you include in your methods, can I actually get the same thing you report? And it turns out even that is pretty hard. So with the same group who was looking at the data availability statements in cognition, one of the things we did is for those data sets that were available, that were accessible, we tried to reproduce the analyses. So a team of us went and we took the data and we took a description from the methods and we tried to get the same thing. And only about a third reproduced without any author assistance. Same data, same description. When we asked the author assistants, we asked them questions. Maybe you didn't mention what covariates you used or didn't mention a correction you used for variance. About another third reproduced. And while we didn't find any decision errors, so we didn't find any evidence that the results would change or the interpretation would change, but almost 40% of the outcomes we couldn't actually match because the information wasn't sufficient. Or we didn't have their code, or the data set they shared didn't really match what they described, and it was hard to know what variables were you even using here, or there's a part of the process missing. So I think one primary problem is a lack of documentation in our own data set, a lack of transparency and documentation of what we're own doing. It's really hard to take methods and replicate them if they can't even reproduce with the data set that gave rise to them. So as a result of some of this work, Cognition is updating their policy to encourage better documentation, encourage the sharing of code for data analysis as well as the data sets, encouraging a higher level of documentation. Along that same effort, there are a number of groups and even some journals, the Journal of American Statistical Association, where it is common to submit code that actually do reproducibility checks. So as part of when you submit a journal article, they have a series of editors. One of the faculty in the School of Public Health is the reproducibility editor for JASA, that they will actually run your code and make sure it reproduces before your article is accepted. There's a journal that's relatively new called Metapsychology that they also offer reproducibility checks. They run their own badge system where they have a reproducibility badge. There are also groups at the University of North Carolina and Yale that are curating for reproducibility. So when they take data into a repository in those locations, they look at it, they check the code, they make sure all the things reported in the articles and tables are matching, they're consistent. So there are a lot of efforts to have that check up front and do some of that work. And I think for me, this really highlights the importance of data curation and that extra thoughtful step before we make data open. And so one of the things I do as part of my work in the data repository for U of M is I do run statistical code. I do look at the variables. I do look at the documentation. What would be needed for another person to use this data? And see that. And I think data management has a huge piece in this, in our own work. And there's a lot of expertise here at the University of Minnesota. Lisa Johnson, who I've quoted here, is the head of the data repository. She also runs the data curation network, which is a system of how do we get different people with a bunch of disciplines so that we have the right disciplinary set of eyes when a data set is deposited to have that look over. IPMS and the Minnesota Population Center, they've been doing this for decades. How do we make data more documented so that people who are reusing it have an easier time? So I think this is a huge step, and I think something immediate that as researchers we can do in our own work, being better documented. I also want to highlight, though, there's always a downside to some of this, particularly in the crisis language, and in the language used to talk about science, is that there's been, as Amy mentioned, the crisis in language and all this drama gets picked up easily by popular press. And they've also been used, particularly reproducibility, in ways that are attempts to undermine science. And I think we need to be cautious about how that's presented and speak about that cautiously. Amy, as well as a few other librarians, have a publication about how reproducibility issues are being politicized by actors and groups looking to undermine science. One illustration of this was the EPA proposed rule. So this was out, I think, over the summer. Commentaries, and the EPA tried to get a proposed rule requiring transparency for all research that would be used to make policy decisions. Well, what that does is it eliminates a lot of the important research that currently exists because it's on humans and the consent is not appropriate to make that public now. So retroactively, it's hard to go back and make important literature public. And that's essentially what this rule would require. And so it would really be used as a way to narrow the amount of research that we're able to use to make policy. So even though it had all the right words in it, it sounded really great, the actual point of it, the result was not good. So I think one of the things to be considered in data sharing is to make sure we're balancing privacy and openness, and understand that requires from the start. So if you're knee-deep into a project now, one of the things we find with the data repository is oftentimes people will try to submit their data, and it turns out their consent form didn't match, or the language wasn't appropriate. And so you told participants you would be doing something that is actually counter to sharing. And so as much as I promote open science, we still have to do this ethically and acknowledge that there are data that can't be shared, and that's okay. And how do we work, from the beginning of projects to be as open as possible? So that's just to other things, less positive reproducibility stuff.